Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our Atkinson Gallery Artist Talk by Muna Malik. I am John Connolly. I'm the director of Santa Barbara City College Art Gallery. And I'm very happy to see how many of you have joined us today. Before we begin, I just wanted to review a few details regarding today's discussion. We anticipate that the presentation today, including a Q&A period, will last about 45 minutes. Please submit your questions for the artist via the chat button at the bottom of your screen at any time during the talk. At the end of Muna's presentation, I will read aloud some of your questions for Muna to respond to. As a reminder, a recording of this conversation will be available on our Atkinson Gallery website in a few days. We would like to thank the Santa Barbara City College Foundation for their ongoing support of the gallery's programming and activities and for use of their Zoom software to present and document today's lecture. I also wanted to remind everyone that this project and talk by Muna Malik is partially supported by a Removing Barriers to STEM Success Title III federal grant. So without further delay, let me introduce Muna Malik. She is a multidisciplinary artist based in Los Angeles, California, whose current work focuses on creating poetic imagery around the narratives of women of color and refugees using abstract paintings and interactive sculpture. Malik's project, Blessing of the Boats, which originated in 2016 at the Northern Sparks Festival in Minneapolis, and was recently included in the River to River Festival at the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council in New York City, will be installed here at the Atkinson Gallery next week. It's the latest iteration of this project, and it will be installed on our outdoor gallery sculpture terrace so that you may view it remotely from Pershing Park and other locations around the city. And I'm sure Muna will share more about that project. So please join me in welcoming Muna Malik.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I wasn't expecting so many people to join, but it's exciting. So my name is Muna Malik. I am, as John mentioned, a multidisciplinary artist, and I think the best way to describe that for me is I choose whatever medium is necessary or needed or best fits how I'd like to kind of talk about or present a topic. I initially started with photography, kind of made my way more into textiles and working with fabrics. And then now I've kind of been experimenting and playing around with sculpture, mainly focusing on using acrylic or mirrors and stainless steel to kind of create these sculptures that we're going to talk about today. So yeah, kind of just diving in. The very first project that I've ever done as far as being an artist was a mixed media, multimedia presentation in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was, at the time I wasn't an art student. I guess I've never really been an art student. I didn't go to school for it. I was actually studying science at the time. But I'd always had my camera and spent most of my free time in the Cedar Riverside community in Minneapolis, Minnesota, working with recent immigrants, oftentimes East African refugees that had moved to the United States, and specifically Minneapolis, Minnesota, to relocate and start entirely new lives. And a lot of my community work and internship work was focused around teenagers that were living within that community. And so this first project was a series of photographs that were mixed media, some collage and others kind of photo interplay, which is the first image. And what the goal of that project was to create one image that spoke to the internal dialogue that a lot of these teenagers were having. And so in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Somali community specifically is predominantly Muslim. And at the time, there was a huge uptick in anti-Islamic rhetoric And a lot of these teenagers are going to school, attempting to assimilate to American culture, but also having to deal with what it feels like to be a first time or a first generation immigrant in the US. So they're going home to their family members and oftentimes their elders and having to deal with this cultural clash, right? Of having to represent your culture and your community and where you come from, but also having to also fit into this new dynamic of being oftentimes like a high school teen, right? So you're already dealing with a lot of identity issues to begin with. And so once you start adding all those different characteristics and context, a lot of those kids were struggling with identity. And so what I would normally do and kind of still do when it comes to a lot of my photo series is getting to know the teens that I'd be working with and kind of working with them to see what their major points of conflict were. And so the first image is of this young man, his name's Saeed, and basically his conversation with me most of the time was around religious, like being religious, but also being like cool and being able to like hang with his friends, right? And so we'd always talk about what identity meant for him. And so he always struggled because he was like, my identity at home is not the same identity I have when I'm out and about in the city and with my friends. I feel like I'm two totally different people and I'm having to play these two different parts. And so sometimes I look in the mirror and I have no idea who, like which side of me is the real side. Are they both, can they both coexist? And is that okay? And the conversation around, by letting go of cultural characteristics, does that make you any less of what your parents are kind of wanting you to be? And so the photograph is of him kind of looking at himself. And as you can see, the two different reflections are something very different, but based off of how the US treats a lot of first generation immigrants, very different experiences in the US. But he's also a Black man in America, and that has an entirely different context in comparison to him being a black man from Somalia. And then the second image is a little bit, it's actually a fairly large multimedia piece or mixed media piece. And it was the conversation around this young woman who was Sudanese, her name's Dua, and what it felt like to be in the same position as lots of immigrants in American history have been put in, right? At one point in time, the Irish were treated fairly horribly because they were like the recent immigrants. And then it was the Japanese because of everything happening with the war. And so what did it feel like to now be this like new group of people going through what felt like an extreme version of what some other cultures have felt in the past, with the political addition and global context of what it is to be anti-Islamic, and so this was another version of kind of connecting those two conversations. So at that time, I was still not an art student and having to make work that spoke to all these things. But for me, it was mostly just a conversation around some of the same questions I was having for myself. So my family is East African, but I was born and raised in the Middle East. We moved to the US when I was young. And for me, I kind of dealt with the same identity conversations, right? Am I Muslim first? Am I now an American first before I am anything else? I was born and raised in Yemen, a country dealing with quite a lot of civil strife right now and famine. And so having to educate a lot of folks on what Yemen was like an interesting new addition for me coming here, and still having to do that today, especially with the context of what's going on in the country. And so this was one way for me to also tap into the same questions I was having for myself. And to move kind of further that into how that turned into larger artworks. One of the new ways that I'm kind of continuing these photo series is by coming up with ways to make it a bit more of a public conversation rather than the small circular circle of working with galleries and working with these students. And one way I've been able to do that, fortunately with the support of an amazing organization called For Freedoms, is developing these boards for their billboard campaigns. So the very first one was a billboard that went up in North Carolina in 2018 for the midterm elections. And the conversation there was, how do we get folks to see the issues around that election in a way a little bit closer to home? And so with it being North Carolina in 2018, which was like the height and extreme of anti-immigrant, it's kind of still going on now, which is a sad thing to say, but anti-immigrant sentiment and people wanting folks to not be able to come here in search of freedom was kind of a conversation I wanted to have. And so the photograph is of a Somali refugee in the outskirts of Somalia, and the text above him says Exodus 22:21, which is a Old Testament Bible verse that kind of speaks to you should treat, depending on which translation of the Bible you use, it kind of touches on a different part of the anti-immigrant sentiment we're having in the United States. So it could be anything from treat your neighbor as if you were once a refugee, given the fact that like Jesus Christ is the definition of why everyone should be for immigration, given the fact that he was a refugee once and in need of support and searching for safety. And so that's what that campaign kind of wanted to focus on. And it being in the heart of the Bible Belt was really like a quick way for me to kind of just have folks question their faith and also question their belief systems. Because sometimes, just based off of how controversial these topics are, people kind of forget what they actually believe and how that plays a role in some of the things that they're spewing, some of the hatred that they're spewing. And so the next one, which is actually just went up in Maine on Monday, is a conversation around the social unrest that's happening today. And it's a very simple question, you know, how many more protests do we need? And it's a photograph of one of the protesters here in Los Angeles during the George Floyd protests. Sadly, these protests have been very poignant and an important mark for my generation and us trying to fight for civil rights in a different way to our ancestors. But I also know that this isn't the last time that we're all going to be in the streets fighting because someone lost their lives at the hands of gun violence and police. And so it's the conversation of how many more times do we need to do this? How many more times do you need to hear people asking for the bare minimum in return for all of this grief that we are all dealing and experiencing? And so this billboard is going up in Maine, and I think another one is up in North Carolina again as well. It seems like a lot of my work finds its way to the South, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, so this is one way that I found that taking those initial roots of me being young, creating work that spoke to me, and finding a way to create that same work and have it speak to others. So then it kind of continues on the photosphere. So during the George Floyd protests, in the height of the COVID crisis, I was basically in the streets. I was in the streets almost every day, protesting and marching with my friends and those that I cared about. And I found myself, most of these were actually taken with just like a point and shoot or even my phone. My point in going out wasn't to be a photojournalist or to capture work. It was to be a part of what was happening around me. And I happened to just take photos of moments that spoke to me as well. So I've got like 40 or 50 photos from the span of a few weeks of being out and about. And those photo series kind of turned into these collages that I usually will just do on my phone or do on my computer, where you take one photograph, and although that photograph speaks to a very particular moment, which most all photographs do, and how I was feeling in the moment, how can you put that on the backdrop of something significantly bigger? So the image on the far right is of a school teacher here in Los Angeles County who decided to bring his two sons to the protests because of the fact that he felt like he was all alone in this conversation of having to make sure that his boys were safe. Meanwhile, we're surrounded by a few hundred people. So the concept of one man feeling so alone in this struggle, meanwhile being surrounded by so many, was like an interesting way to have this conversation. So I put him on the backdrop of two different types of deserts, right? One where it's like barren and like nothing of life and substance is there. And then the other where it's like a bit more lively and vibrant and colorful because of the fact that the way that Black men are treated in America is a multi-layered conversation, and based off of where you are and who you're speaking with, you get tons of different responses. The other is a daughter on top of her father on her shoulders, kind of again amongst the protests and like the thought process about Black women needing the support of everyone around us in order for Black women, or I'm in this conversation as well, to feel the support that we need. We kind of have to be on everyone's shoulders, and like, what does that look like? And I thought that this was a very poignant way of putting that, is oftentimes like fathers are that first person to kind of step up when we need folks to step up. And then the other was a conversation around the fight for freedom between, and the connection for the fight for freedom between our Latin American community or Latinx community and our Black community in one particular moment, right? We're standing in front of the federal courthouse here in Los Angeles, which has a multitude of reasons of being important in this conversation. And I wish it wasn't COVID, because if you could see like the emotion that was coming out of these folks and in their faces, it would have been kind of another step in the photograph. But it's a sky high issue. It's so far up there that it's hard for any of us to think we're able to achieve solving it, but it doesn't make it any less important, even though it seems so hard and impossible to get to. And that's kind of why like the sky imagery is present. And so, yeah, so that's a lot of my photo visual work, and trying to have multiple different conversations, and based off of who you are and your personal experiences, these images could mean totally different things for you. And I think that powerful art opens up space for people to have different conversations while looking at the same thing. And so that kind of ties into what I wanted to do as far as my sculptural work. And so I'll speak past the abstract paintings. The abstract paintings are more than anything for me. A lot of the other work takes a lot of thought and and a lot of my mental health issues go into that, whereas my abstract work is a way for me to just breathe and set my mind and place it somewhere free, just to be able to create in the studio with no one else around me. Oftentimes I don't have to explain what any of this means, and there aren't any limitations to where I can take it. So that's kind of just why I threw this in there, as a way to kind of point out that there's a lot of artists that I think we all look up to. A lot of my mentors I've found that produce work that no one ever sees, and it's always for them. And that's what I find the abstract paintings are for me. And so that kind of brings me to the project that I'm doing with Santa Barbara City College, but also what I've done in the past. And that conversation was, how do you create artwork that opens up space for the community around it to be a part of the work and to live with the work forever? And how do you create work that touches on a multitude of issues, but also kind of has the semblance of childlike innocence? And so that's how I came up with this Blessing of the Boats project. So the boat itself is supposed to resemble and leave room for it being like an altar or a space for a vigil. So the very first boat that I made in 2016 was in collaboration with a local community arts organization in Minneapolis. And I basically annoyed the folks at the Northern Spark Arts Festival to allow me to do this piece. I wasn't really on their like artist roster at the time. I wasn't an artist. I was going to school for science. And so they kind of took a chance on me, and they were like, okay, here's one part of the festival that's kind of open and free, and like, we'd love to see what work you guys can kind of come up with. And so we came up with the Blessing of the Boats, which in its basic form is a way to get people to write letters and messages in the first iteration to refugees and immigrants that they may or may not have come across or would get a chance to meet. So at the height of this project, in 2016, it was the height of the Mediterranean refugee crisis. And so people were seeing these images on the news of boats sinking in the Mediterranean Sea, of folks from Northern Africa or even places in like Syria, trying to make it to Europe for safety. And so my goal was, it's such a tough topic to talk about. How can we break down, one, all of the biases and controversial conversations happening around that and bring it back to the basics of these are other people, human beings, searching and looking for safety and finding the one way that they can do that, and by taking this like treacherous journey. And so the question, it was a very simple prompt of what would you say to someone going through this journey if you could like meet them today. And so people were essentially taken on an artist-led journey. I had a few of my poet friends join in on the project, and as folks were journeying across the Stone Arch Bridge, which is kind of shown in that photograph, they were learning more and more through poetry what was actually happening in the Mediterranean. And based off of which poet you've got a different story. So I had a few of my friends were East African or North African, and were kind of speaking from the perspective of the experiences that North African refugees were going through, whereas others were kind of speaking to it from a place of like what Syrian refugees at the time were going through and trying to escape the civil war in Syria. And so as you got closer to the boat, which is kind of far, when you see it from a far away angle, you can't really tell what it is. It kind of just looks like this beacon, this beam of light. But as you get closer, you're realizing it's a boat. And as you're folding the origami, you're realizing you're actually folding it into a paper boat. And by the time you actually get to the piece, you realize that you're actually now a part of like a vigil and a moment of remembrance for those that have passed away, each boat representing some of those lives. And then the poets asked everyone that simple prompt of like, what would you say if you could say something? And so folks got a chance to write their messages onto the pieces of origami boats that they had just put together, and then add it to the actual installation. So I think in Northern Spark that year, there were about maybe 5,000 people that came through. And what was really interesting for me, it was supposed to be like a moment of solace in this entire festival. Like it's a roaring overnights festival where people are, you know, spending time with family, there's food, there's drinks, and people are at a lot of different stations. But what ended up happening at this installation was people stayed for quite a while and kind of sat with the piece, and it turned into like a really like somber, but also beautiful moment where everyone was kind of in the silence together with the poets continuing to speak. And so, let's see. That's kind of what it looked like from afar. This is kind of towards the beginning. The smaller image on the bottom left, which I hope is translating to you guys, you can kind of see like the crowd starting to gather, and it kind of got to a point where sometimes we'd get in trouble with the fire department because it could be like a fire hazard, even though we're surrounded by water. But that's kind of what the piece looked like. And so overnight, from sunset to sunrise, people kept adding and adding and adding to the piece until it was kind of overflowing. And that was my first iteration and dive into what sculpture and interactive artwork could really do and mean. And so that kind of led me to this year. So towards the end of last year, I started working on the second version of Blessing of the Boats. Ideally for me with this project, it was thinking of what does this project look like if I recreate it every 4 years, depending on what's happening in the world, but what's also happening with me. So this first iteration for 2020, I started midway through 2019, which sounds like a million years ago at this point. But and so I started building a new version of it. It's actually made out of wood, and it kind of looks like plexiglass from the photos, but it's actually finely stretched fabric. So you can imagine how difficult it is to get fabric taut over such a long, interestingly shaped piece. But it's all made out of, I think, a total of 6 panels of like finely stretched fabric. And this boat was about 25 feet long and I think 12 feet high. I might be a little bit off on the dimensions. And it was about getting folks to have a different kind of conversation. This was before the pandemic and before a lot of things that have happened this year. And so I did a private viewing of the piece before I actually got a chance to like show it anywhere else. And I asked folks to come to my studio. As you can see, I think the far right images of my studio, which is like this like little warehouse space, and kind of just asked friends and anyone else that decided to come to to do the same thing. What is something that you would want someone else to read that would have a potential impact on them? Whether they're a refugee or an immigrant or someone who just kind of needed to hear something new. And kind of the same thing kind of happened again, where folks ended up staying with the piece and staying with each other in the process. If anyone on the Zoom calls ever tried to make a paper boat with fairly rough instructions, it's kind of hard and can be a bit frustrating. And so it kind of forced people that didn't know each other in the studio space to work together to like do it. And so I should have taken some screenshots of some messages I'd received afterwards, but people walked away from the installation and the project, that's my dog, having made friends with folks that they'd never met before, purely based off of the fact that they needed help in building the boats. And also then it turned into this really interesting moment of everyone kind of like seeing each other's messages and what they'd written, and the process of adding it to the piece. I had a harpist playing in the studio that day just because, as many of the folks on this call have probably experienced, gallery openings or showings can tend to be a bit loud and just like a little chaotic. And so having the harpist there playing off to the side kind of forced everyone to stay around the same thought process and idea that we're there for something more, we're there for something bigger. And it kind of was a really cool way to get people to kind of like try something different, you know? And so as that project, I think this viewing I did was the last week of February, so maybe 2 weeks before the coronavirus kind of changed the world. And so in the very few months of the coronavirus, I, much like a lot of my friends and mentors that are artists, was dealing with a lot of, just question marks. Like, what does this mean as far as producing art and creating art? Like, if the world's shut down and no one's able to connect with each other, like, kind of what is the point of making art? Is it for self? How do you do that if it's for self, if you aren't feeling the need to make said work? Like, I didn't have any artistic drive in the beginning of the coronavirus. I was just dealing with, the uncertainty of everything around us. And so that kind of led to this project here that was debuted in Battery Park in New York City, I think 2 months ago now, because it's October now, so back in August. And that thought process was, at the time, New York was dealing with the toughest situation when it came to the coronavirus, with hospitals being overrun, obviously many people losing their lives. I had a few friends that kind of lived near ERs and would see like those trucks that were parked out front, and it kind of just seemed like a never ending struggle, right? And as we kind of got past that initial height of the crisis and people were starting to like kind of start thinking about what the new normal looked like, and the new normal being not having any real new human connection or physical human connection. What would that mean in terms of art and art production? What would that mean in terms of like just human connection and making friends and relationships? But also it set up, I think this is still the case today, but it opened up the conversation of, with us seeing that the world around us is finally at a standstill and we're all kind of having the same fate in some ways. What would the world look like if we all banded together to kind of produce a new and better society? And so this sculpture was a way to kind of get folks, specifically in New York, to kind of think of that. And so the sculpture was kind of the same situation, still a boat, a bit more geometric, but it's completely covered in mirrored vinyl. So when you arrive at the piece, you not only see yourself, but you see of anyone else who's around you. You actually see the community and the environment around you. And so the prompt for this piece was also super simple. It was like, whew, my brain's going dark on me, but if you could do anything in creating this new and better society, like what would you do and what's your part in that? right? And so again, asking people to do the same process of folding the origami boat, coming up with what their personal answer was, but then also adding that piece, adding their message into the sculpture, and they would build up over time with the thought process that much like the fabric version of the boats, this one was also illuminated from the inside, which you can kind of see on the image to the right. But as images or as messages from folks coming to the installation continue to add to the sculpture, the light from the inside would dim, because in reality, like, the actual light and the point of this entire installation isn't for the illuminated, like, you know, fake light from the inside. It's actual people's messages. That's where real hope is. And I think one thing that I remember from school is once you write something down, you're significantly more likely to remember it, but also hopefully significantly more likely to actually follow through. And the fact that you're seeing that hundreds and thousands, hopefully, of other people have done the same thing and have kind of put in how they're going to try and work to create a better society, it pushes you to try and think of how you will actually make that possible. And so that was like the idea for this iteration of the boat. And so that's what I like about sculptural work, and what I want to continue doing when it comes to the sculptures is finding ways for me to produce the work that I'd like to produce, but also find a way for community members and those around me to be able to like add on to the piece, because how much more exciting is it for not just adults, but for kids to kind of be a part of something and then see how that piece that they've added to kind of leads to some physical or real life change, and kind of seeing that piece grow as they grow as well. And so that was the idea for Blessing of the Boats. And I'm really excited to be doing it here or with Santa Barbara City College and working with some students, just because it's a fun process. And I think it's just one way to get people to slow down and think of themselves, but also think of the community around them. And so, yeah, so that's my artist talk for the day. I will stop sharing my screen. And so, yeah, now I think we are diving into questions.
Yes, so everybody, if you could put your questions in the chat below, and I can pass them along to Muna. I love seeing the evolution of the boat project in just such a short period already. The 4 years, and you mentioned that you envision it as something that you would do every 4 years. I mean, do you see that? How long do you see that going on? What's the prospect for this? Is this a lifetime project? How do you? It's hard to say, I know, but how do you envision it developing, or is there a finite point in the future?
It's hard to say, but I mean, ideally, it's a lifelong process. I found that depending on what stage I am in life and what I'm doing, the boat size may differ. But yeah, I think it's a lifelong process. I'm already thinking about what the next iteration looks like 4 years from now, and like the conversation around climate change, just based off of the fact that we have, I think, 7 years to make some real strides when it comes to what's happening in the world around us in order for us to make a tangible impact on how climate change is moving forward. And so I think that's where my brain's going. But I think the marker of having it be every 4 years might also change. This might be every 2 years type of project, or, you know, I might not touch it again for 10 years, given the fact that I've done 2 in 6 months. But yeah, that's kind of where my brain is going.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much potential with the, you know, somebody mentioned in the chat that it's such a great metaphor, and especially with illumination and the origami messages. But I'm just wondering, you know, I just think it's interesting to think about how it can change in the future and how it can grow. And how did it change from the first iteration where people were able to walk with the poets and learn about the project to Battery Park City, where everybody had to socially distance and there were masks and all those kind of things? How did that project, in terms of people's reactions and your, you know, what you got out of it?
Yeah, I think the change, or the major changes I noticed was the iteration in my studio and the iteration of Battery Park were much more about the self, and a very intimate moment with you and your thought process, whereas the one in Minnesota or Minneapolis specifically was about was like a community vigil, you know, if you decided to sit there and like spend time at the piece and sit with each other, some people being a lot more emotional than others, and it was a very like community driven piece. And so that's one of the things. And I think the Battery Park was a highlight of, people had been home for, at that point, was that March to August. So people had been home and like really quarantining, and kind of were looking for a reason to go out and like experience something that wasn't the norm of like home, the grocery store, and a ton of Zoom calls. And so what I noticed with a lot of people there is they were like discovering how it felt like to kind of be in a public setting, still distant from anyone else, but also still kind of slowly getting back to something that was a bit more normal. But it was, again, it was still very solitary and less community driven as it was the first round.
And so people are curious, how will the Santa Barbara community be able to add their messages to this installation, which you grappled with in New York, and we're talking about and grappling with ourselves. And the other flip side of that, or the subsequent side of that question, is where do the messages end up? And do you have like an archive? And,
So I've been archiving them. Ideally, I will set up like just like the Blessing of the Boats website and have everyone's pieces up there. With the way that some people actually do their boats, they I got a few like tweets about this, but people have found that if they write their message out first and then fold, it's a very private message. So it's been interesting to find ways to kind of photograph where the person's private message is still private, but also kind of highlighting it and showing it for others. So there's one thing there. And I think the other specific to Santa Barbara is there will be receptacles that folks will be able to, receptacles is a really weird word to use, but there will be a few areas in the city where people can still hold their origami boats and like place it into these like boxes in the city that will then be collected and then added to the piece that you can place messages inside. And then the other is you can create one on your own and mail it to, and I'll kind of have you speak to the address for it to be mailed to. And then last but not least, you can create one, take photos of it yourself and actually send them to me or to the Atkinson Gallery, at which point I'll still add it to the archive. And so those are the ways that I'm making sure that the actual messages are preserved. But all the physical messages that I do receive are all being saved and being essentially added into the installation, and they will live in the installation forever. Outside of the archiving, they'll hopefully just fill the piece, and it'll be just a way for all of us to kind of be a part of one piece.
And I remember in your original proposal that you had an idea for a book project.
Yeah. So the first messages from the 2016 installation and all the further installations that I do that are specific to refugees and immigrants are actually being made into little booklets that are translated to a few different languages and sent out to refugee camps around the world, mostly focusing on East Africa and in the Middle East at the moment, but having that also open up. Because as we all know, with climate change, there are going to be a lot more climate refugees existing around the world.
And then from earlier on in the talk, there was a question about why you switched from science to art. And then another question came in, since you didn't go to school for art, did you self-teach yourself how to do the installations? Did you work with a team or mentor? And you mentioned mentors in your talk, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, specific to jumping into art, I went to school for psychology and neuroscience with the thought process that I was going to be a doctor. Towards the end of that journey, realized I wasn't doing it for the right reasons and my heart wasn't really in it. Was very fortunate enough to transition from school to working for an incredible disaster relief nonprofit called Team Rubicon. Sorry, my dog might pop in here, and that's just because he likes being on camera. So started with a nonprofit that did disaster relief work, and that kind of, one, gave me the ability to kind of see the power of helping people in a way that wasn't being a doctor, but also gave me the space and room outside of the actual work to explore creating art more thoughtfully. At that time, I was still doing photography for fun and creating some of these like multimedia or mixed media works, just because I, like my artist brain couldn't stop not creating work. But the job kind of let me have enough space to be able to start producing larger works. And at that time, I was really fortunate to have met a few of my art mentors that I'm very good friends and close with today, from, Hank Willis Thomas, a really prolific artist based in New York, his wife, Rajuku Hockley, who's an incredible curator at the Whitney, Jose Parla, another incredibly talented graffiti-based, like, abstract artist in New York, and that kind of just led to building this community of artists whose work I really admired and could learn from. An incredible community-based working artist that does a lot of like installation type work. Miguel Luciano is like another who I looked up to, but also is like a really good friend to me now. And the process of teaching myself was more of, what do I want to make? What conversation do I want to have? What's the medium that I can best utilize to make that possible? And if I don't know how to do that medium yet, what are the resources available just using the internet to help me learn? Specific to sculpture, a lot of that was just like hands-on tinkering. Specific to multimedia work or like installation, like general, I would say that YouTube is the most amazing educational resource that exists out there. One highlight is the Met does these really amazing artist series where they'll like go in depth on any particular artist, and anywhere from like a 15-minute to like a 45-minute video focused on an artist. And a lot of those videos had really great views into the studios of a lot of these artists, where I could see some of the tools that they would use, and whether it's a 15-second clip of someone using clay in a particular way, I would just try and like emulate that or recreate that in my own space, and kind of just trial and error figuring it out over time. I don't know if I plan on ever going to school for art, but if I do, I look forward to it, because it's just going to be 2 years of dedication to what I'm already doing in the studio. But at the moment, it's kind of just been figuring it out.
Well, we're almost out of time, sadly. But I had one more question that came in. I think we have time for one more. What is your biggest tip for young activists and artists on using art and design as a vehicle for activism and change?
My biggest tip is just make work that speaks to you, even if you think that no one else is really listening, because people are, and what speaks to you is probably speaking to a few hundred or a few thousand people out there. And then 2 is, if there are folks whose work that you admire, whether that's like artists that have been working for forever or other artists that may not so, send the message and find a way to reach out. You'd be surprised how many big artists respond to their Instagram DMs or just like emails, cold calling emails with big artists. I never thought it would work, but people respond. It might take a week or 2 months, but you'll get a response. But just push forward, and what you're creating is going to touch someone. And I think all the artists I admire are where they are today because they kept producing for a long period of time. So you may not, become famous in a year or 2, but if you've been producing for 10 to 15, I think your work is significantly more prolific.
Thank you, Muna. Thank you for being here and for sharing everything about your work. We are so looking forward to launching the Atkinson Gallery Santa Barbara version of the Blessing of the Boats next week. And for more information, you guys can go to our website or the upcoming exhibitions, and there'll be information about where to mail the messages, where to send them if you take a picture of them, and exactly where the drop-off points are going to be. We're still finalizing those details. So thanks for joining us today. It's really great to see everybody. Thank you.
Yes.